Today on Uncommon Sense, a very special episode. We're sharing with you the keynote address from this summer's Chesterton Conference on Saint Francis of Assisi, the book by G.K. Chesterton. Our keynote address was given by Bishop Robert Barron. Enjoy.
Thanks, everybody. Well, thank you, everybody. Archbishop, thank you for that beautiful introduction. I appreciate that very much. I really think one of the great churchmen in America is right here tonight. So thank you for your presence. And I'm really delighted, I said this at the homily today, but really delighted to be with all of you. My first Chesterton conference, though I've been with you in spirit and have been a long-time supporter of Chesterton. Any Chicagoans here? There gotta be some Chicagoans, huh? Can I, as I begin, I want to pay tribute to three Chicago priests who had a big role in my coming to know G.K. Chesterton. The first one is not a household name by any means, Father Stanley Rudke. What if anyone remembers Father Rudke? Dale does, of course. And well, I'll tell you the story. I was a freshman at Notre Dame University, and then the summer after my first year, I really got the priesthood bug, and I went out to the college seminary and decided I would enter the college seminary in Chicago. So I went to the academic dean, and he went over my transcript from Notre Dame and said, "Oh, this is all very great, but you are missing an English requirement, and you're kind of applying late, so the only one available is Father Rudke's course in G.K. Chesterton." Well, honestly, at that point, I was 19 years old. I knew nothing about either Father Rudke or G.K. Chesterton, never heard either name. I said, well, okay, I'll take the class. And it was a great grace because Rudke, I thought he was ancient. He was probably about 50 at the time, But he was not a Chesterton dilettante. He was a Chesterton master. And we would have read probably The Everlasting Man and Orthodoxy and, the great standard texts of Chesterton. But I first was introduced by a real Chesterton master, and it lit my mind on fire about G.K. Chesterton. Even though it was a bit like reading Shakespeare for the first time when you don't really understand everything, but you're in the presence of something really special. That was my experience of Chesterton under Father Rudke's direction. The second Chicago priest, I'm sure nobody knows, Father Jim Lyons. Did you know Jim? Of course, yeah. Jim Lyons was a very Chestertonian figure. Talk about the presence of mind elsewhere, his definition of absent-mindedness. Jim was, when I knew him, was already an older man, probably in his upper 60s. And a real, I know, I'm in my 60s. I can get away with saying it. He was a real eccentric. Jim would talk to you over dinner, and he'd be eating a little bit of chicken, and you would see you take the chicken. He always wore a clerical suit, and he'd put it in his pocket to take home for later. And he had the classic, he always wore a rabbi like this, that you could put the rabbi in boiling water and have a delicious soup, because of all the meals that were on it. So he was a Chestertonian. You remember, Dale, what he was like? Wonderful, wonderful, lovely man. And we used to talk long into the night about G.K. Chesterton. So I want to pay tribute to Jim Lyons. The third one, this might surprise some of you. This is a much more of a household name. Who remembers Father Andrew Greeley? So remember Greeley, let's say 40 years ago, would have been probably the best known Catholic in America. Sociologist and commentator and novelist and controversial for that reason. I'll tell you the story. Greeley was famous for writing novels, kind of romantic novels that had some sexual element in them, and people were kind of, how does a priest write about this? And there was a lady in Chicago who approached him and said, Father Greeley, it doesn't bother me at all because these novels prove to me that you're faithful to your celibacy because it's true. And he would tell this because she said, no one who wrote those scenes has ever had sex. So, and Greeley told that story out himself. But did you realize he also wrote crime novels, murder mysteries, the Blackie Ryan mysteries? And of course, Blackie Ryan was a bishop, but he was clearly modeled after Father Brown. But I remember from Greeley, he could quote long sections of Lepanto by memory. And when he was a young seminarian back in the 50s, I guess it would have been, loved G.K. Chesterton. So I think of those three Chicago priests had a big impact on my own appropriation of Chesterton. I was really happy. I think it was Brandon Vaught who, I had just been named bishop up here in Minnesota, and almost immediately the invitation came, could you come to the Twin Cities to talk about Chesterton? And when he mentioned it was in honor of the 100th anniversary of the publication of Saint Francis, I was just delighted to accept. And one reason was I hadn't read that book in a long time. I am much more naturally given to Aquinas, and I knew that text pretty well from Chesterton. I had read the Francis text when I was a probably very young man, probably Rutge's class, but I had not read it for a long time. And I said, good, I'd love the opportunity to get back into this Franciscan side of G.K. Chesterton. I think it was in Joseph Pierce's biography that I realized what Dale talked about tonight, that how much Francis was kind of woven into the consciousness of G.K. Chesterton, even taking Francis as his confirmation name. Maybe a homage to his wife, too, Francis, but I think also Francis of Assisi. Maybe their similar girth led me to associate Chesterton and Aquinas. But I think it's certainly fair to say, even as he loved St. Thomas Aquinas, stylistically he's much more Franciscan, isn't he? There's nothing of Thomas's, very kind of rationalistic, even sterile sort of literary style in Chesterton. It's much more the lyricism of Francis. And as we heard, Francis' life was like a poem, and of course Chesterton's one of the great poetic writers of the 20th century. So that's a natural connection. Also, when I reread Francis, the Francis book, I was struck, as I always am, by the champagne-like quality of Chesterton's prose. You remember Churchill was asked, what's it like to meet Franklin Roosevelt? And he said it was like opening a bottle of champagne. And I always have that experience when I read Chesterton. And, you'd never take a bottle of champagne and chug it, right? I mean, it would be too much. And I find that a page of Chesterton has got so much in it. It's like a hyper-rich dessert. You couldn't possibly you take a little bit of time because it's so rich. I have the habit of reading with a pen, and I underline and check marks and this and that. I don't with Chesterton because I'd underline every darn line. But that's true. That's how he writes. And there's hardly anyone I know, maybe Shakespeare, who's like that. Or every line is just not just stylistically beautiful, but so packed with insight. And I had that experience rereading the Francis book, which was just a great thrill. And then finally, the relevance of it. It's 100 years old, but man, does that book speak to our time. And what I'm going to do in this brief talk is isolate, I think it's like 3 major moves that I think are really important for our own time. So if you're keeping score, that's what I'm doing. Oh, and I'm very grateful, Dale, because I had said, oh, you're talking on Francis? And is it just going to be overlap with my talk? And so I sent him the notes, and he said, oh, no. Mine's, and it was indeed about all the other references in Chesterton. But that line that Paul VI quoted, that's the rhetorical high point in my talk. So, but that's good. The Romans said repetitio mater studiorum, right? Repetition is the mother of studies. So we'll keep that one in our minds. Okay, so let me start with the way he starts, which is the section called Approaching Francis, approaching this great figure. He says, we could approach Francis from a purely natural or a purely supernatural point of view, and both are inadequate. Both, he thought, would render a sort of distorted picture. What he proposes is beginning with what his own culture finds intriguing about Francis, and there was a lot. So go back now to the 1920s, and in the Western civilization, there were a lot of things in Francis that, hey, those are interesting. But then there are all sorts of things in Francis that the society of Chesterton's time would find really strange and really off-putting. So Chesterton says, I'm going to adopt the classic pedagogical method, which is begin with the familiar and use it as a bridge to the unfamiliar. And I think that's a very wise way to do it. Because I would say today the same thing. Think of our time, especially in this kind of woke period. There are a lot of things that our culture would naturally appreciate in Francis of Assisi. Think of his love of nature. We probably call it today environmentalism. Well, that would be very attractive to a lot of people today. His love of animals. People that have a strong sense of the importance of the non-human realm, they'd find that beautiful in him. His devotion, obviously, to the ways of peace. How important that is to many people in our culture. Think even of his attitude of, religious openness and tolerance, the journey to the Muslim lands and all of that, people find very attractive. At the same time, just as in Chesterton's era, there are a lot of things in this great saint that our culture would find very hard to take, very hard to understand. Think of his radical, even fierce asceticism. Father Larry Goslin's here. There's Father Larry, who's a great friend of mine from Santa Barbara, Franciscan friar out at the Santa Barbara Mission, and a great embodiment, I think, of the Franciscan spirit. So he knows well there's a Poor Clare monastery there. I used to say Mass there about once every couple of weeks. And in the Poor Clare Chapel, there's a statue of Francis. Trust me, it's not, brother, sun, sister, moon traipsing down the hillside of Assisi. It's this very gaunt, very austere figure, remember Father Larry, with a skull at his feet. Well, that's Francis too. He is the kid traipsing down the hillside in Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, and he's this fiercely, even frighteningly ascetic figure. Think of the dying Francis who said, take off my habit and let me die naked on the ground. Well, that's an extraordinary thing, and I think a lot of people would find that hard to understand. He loved animals, yeah, but as we heard, he was pretty tough on the animal that was his own body, right? Yes, he went to visit the Muslim leader, but it wasn't just to commune with him, it was to convert him. Then there's Mount Alverna, there's the stigmata. What do we make of all that? So the approach of beginning with what's attractive about him, yes, but let it lead us to what's strange about Francis. And what I'm going to do is just cut to the chase because it's so good and so wise. Here's Chesterton trying to resolve this tension, these two Francises. Tell it as the tale of one of the troubadours and the wild things he would do for his lady, and the whole of the modern puzzle disappears. In such a romance, there'd be no contradiction between the poet gathering flowers in the sun and enduring a freezing vigil in the snow. All these riddles would easily be resolved in the simplicity of any noble love. Think of a husband and his wife. You can imagine the husband writing beautiful, gushing, romantic, lyrical poetry, if he was so inclined. And you could imagine easily that same husband staying up all night, denying himself sleep and food and drink to care for his wife in her sickness. In other words, the expressive romanticism and the fierce asceticism. Yes, indeed. What explains it? It's pretty easy, actually. It's love. When you love somebody, you will manifest that love precisely in this paradoxical way. What the critics get wrong is seeing Francis ideologically, as though he's a philosophical figure proposing a point of view. No, he's somebody in love. And see, I think from Chesterton's time to our time and across the ages, that's the most important thing to emphasize about Christianity. How good Pope Benedict was on this, wasn't he? Christianity is not a philosophy. You can distill philosophical principles from it. You can use philosophical ideas to support it, but it's not a philosophy, not an ideology. Christianity is a relationship to a person. We love him. We love Jesus. And so, yes, we're going to throw flowers in our enthusiasm and our joy, and we will endure the greatest asceticism because we love him. See, I think, brothers and sisters, that's a very important theme for us in our time. You can tell in a second when Christianity is being reduced to an ideology or reduced to a philosophy. That's when we start splitting apart, by the way. We come together when we realize this truth. It's a relationship to a person. I love the connection between this insight in the Francis book and then that famous passage in Orthodoxy, where he's talking about not so much a particular saint, but about the complexity of the mystical body in its relationship to Christ. Here's the quote, and I'll say a little bit about it. The balance was not always in one man's body as in Becket's. Remember, that's the reference to Thomas of Becket wearing the glorious robes of his office on the outside and the hair shirt on the inside. So in his own person, there was both exuberance and asceticism, right? So it was not always in one man's body as in Becket's. The balance was often distributed over the whole body of Christendom. Because a man prayed and fasted on the northern snows, flowers could be flung at his festival in the southern cities. That's marvelous, isn't it? There's the mystical body that includes this great ascetic saint in the northern snows, but on his feast day, they throw flowers in the southern sun. Of course they do, because across the ages, in all the dimensions of the mystical body, what you have are people in love with Christ. And so it's appropriate. The church expresses itself in this paradoxical way. But the paradox is resolved by the fact of love. Beautiful. That's his approach to Francis. Dead right, it seems to me. Now, the next thing I'm going to talk about, GK calls the world St. Francis found. Second chapter in the book. In my humble opinion, this is one of the really great masterpieces in Chesterton's prose. Not just the style, that's always there, but I mean the substance of the insight, I think is absolutely remarkable. And to call this a masterpiece of Chesterton is saying a lot, of course, because he writes so many masterpieces. It's one of those insights that not only tells us about his subject here, but it sheds light in every direction. It illumines so much in Christianity. Here's the analysis. The principal reason that many moderns tend to see Francis as a fairly conventional environmentalist or naturalist is they forget the complex cultural history that preceded him. Francis of Assisi was part of this great rebirth that happened in Western civilization in the 12th and the early 13th centuries. Remember a film that was so important to me when I was a kid, Kenneth Clark's Civilization. His second episode of that is called The Great Thaw. And Clark remarks that at that time, 12th century, early 13th, it's as though the whole earth became radioactive. And he meant that in civilizations all over the world, there was this kind of Russian spring, there was this kind of rebirth. And then he said, nowhere was it greater than in Western Europe, because perhaps nowhere was it needed more than there. And what you find now in this early Renaissance, 12th and 13th century, the great cathedrals eventually come, the late Romanesque churches too. The devotion to the Blessed Mother comes. Chartres Cathedral, Dante, eventually Thomas Aquinas and high scholasticism. All of that comes out of this marvelous regeneration. And key to that moment was our friend Francis of Assisi. Now, here's Chesterton's point. We mustn't read this Renaissance the way we read the 16th century Renaissance, the better known one. That one we tend to read as what? Renaissance. It's simply the rebirth of classical civilization after a long dormancy. But GK says, no, that's the wrong way to read the Renaissance of the 12th and early 13th century. What was going on was a coming back to life after a long period of purification and purgation. Let me first give you GK's quote, which will be better than anything I'm going to say. Quote, "It was the end of a penance, or, if it be preferred, a purgation, It marked the moment when a certain spiritual expiation had finally worked out, and certain spiritual diseases had finally been expelled from the system. Now, could I invite you, keep that quote in mind, to go back to my homily from a few hours ago when I talked about false worship. Right? I think it's a basic biblical intuition, as Dale was pointing out too, is what we falsely worship will eventually turn on us. Again, take that to the bank. Anyone involved in pastoral life or pastoral counseling, it's a basic principle, and the psychologists don't know that. We know that from the spiritual tradition. When you falsely worship something, it's sex, it's pleasure, it's money, it's power, it's honor, whatever, a devil you want to choose. If we turn those into ultimate values, points of ultimate concern, they will turn on us and eventually destroy us. I've talked about the Elijah and the priests of Baal. The priests of Baal who dance around the altars calling upon the false gods. And the fire never comes, of course, it can't. But more importantly, they wound themselves in the process. Remember, they're slashing at themselves till they bleed. Talk to any addict about that. And we sinners, we're all sinners in this room, we're all addicts. We all tend to worship at these false altars. And that turns on us and destroys us. Here's Chesterton's point. I don't know anybody else in the tradition who sees it this way, who reads it this way, but it's so good. What had happened to the classical world was precisely this. What ought to be a sane and balanced and limited appreciation of the world and of nature had turned into a worship of it. And in that process, a deep sickness began to take hold of classical society. Think here too, go back to the beginning of the book of Genesis. As all the elements of creation come forward in a beautiful liturgical procession. I think we Catholics appreciate that as, the first day, evening came, morning followed. The second day, evening came, morning, the third day. So it's a liturgical procession, at the end of which the human being arrives. What's our job? Well, the last person in the liturgical procession is meant to lead the praise, right? Well, there it is. There's the biblical vision. Our job is to lead nature, all of creation, in a chorus of praise to our common Father. See, and there's that idea that's really good about nature is not our mother. See, that's a paganism, or that's a naturalism. But rather, nature, all the elements of the world, are like our brothers and sisters, and together we praise the one God. Now you've got it right. What happened to classical civilization? And it's such a penetrating reading of it. In the measure that they turned to the worship of the world, they became sick and decadent. Now, here's the quote. The truth is that those who worship health cannot remain healthy. This is one example. Is this common today, by the way? The loss of God. And what do we find? Did you ever read like those health magazines? And they're telling you, what you got to do, and what you don't do this, and you got to do that, and well, these are the descendants of like Cotton Mather. These are the descendants of the Puritans, but they're not worried about spiritual order, but health. The truth is, those who worship health, nothing wrong with health. I'm all in favor of it. But when you worship it, you can't remain healthy. And then here's the repetitio mater studiorum. The moment sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant. That's the context for that quote. See, that's absolutely right. So I'm pick your poison here. Whether it's nature, it's sex, it's pleasure, it's power, it's political parties, it's your own family, it's whatever. Anything in this world that you turn into an ultimate value will turn on you. Now, here's what I actually have in my notes to prove that this was the rhetorical high point. So the moment sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant. Then I said, that last quote should be inscribed on every wall of every institution in the Western world. Right? And I hope, again, what everybody appreciates, is nothing against sex. I mean, right away, that's what the enemies of the church will always do. But on the contrary, it's nothing against sex. Again, the language, the moment sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant. If I make it something that I'm worshiping, and by God, that's happening, in our world, then it becomes a tyrant. It will turn on you. That is such a basic biblical intuition, and Chesterton got that in his bones. Gosh, tell our kids that, tell our young people about that. It's a celebration of sexuality. So here's I think the really cool insight of Chesterton. What made possible the breaking of this spell, this sort of dark enchantment of the classical world, where it started to worship the things of nature? What made it possible? He says the long asceticism imposed by Christianity. Dale must know. Where's the quote that the only real light in the Dark Ages was the church, right? Isn't it? It's orthodoxy, where most of the great quotes are. But you see, the point there is like, oh yeah, the classical world, how wonderful, then the terrible Dark Ages, and then the Renaissance, or whatever you want to choose, or Descartes or something. But what an unnuanced, stupid reading of history. Well, I mean, it's true. But how insightful this move was, that no, there was something that was really wrong. There was something really off in classical civilization, which is why it collapsed, by the way. And what was imposed, not just some kind of arbitrary darkness, just because people, they're anti-intellectual or something. No, it was a long asceticism that was imposed by Christianity, so as to wean the world off of this worship of nature into a healthier relationship. This is maybe 10 years ago. I just got hooked on these biographies of these great 4th century figures. This is Chrysostom, it's Jerome, it's Gregory of Nyssa, it's obviously Augustine. What was it that led almost everybody in the 4th century, all the best and brightest people, all of them wanted to take to the hills and take to caves? They really did. I mean, the great John Chrysostom, the greatest preacher, but Chrysostom thought he was a failure because he went as a young man to the cave to live in total asceticism, and it wrecked his health. And he said, I'm just the worst ascetic. All right, I'll become a parish priest, And that's true, though. So he goes, and then they make him a bishop, But and then what did Augustine want to do after his conversion? He wanted to, go back home and have a kind of philosophical retirement, and that they would have, stayed philosophical and theological conversations. He wanted to withdraw from the world. Who was their hero? All these people. Anthony of the Desert. Anthony was the hero of all those great 4th century figures. What was it? I think Chesterton's got it. They were, if you want, channeling the zeitgeist of the time. They knew there had to be a purgation. Here's Chesterton saying it, of course, 20 times better than I just said it. They had to go into the desert where they could find no flowers, or even into the cavern where they could see no stars. Into that desert and that cavern, the highest human intellect entered for some 4 centuries, and it was the wisest thing it could do. I don't know anyone else in our tradition that sees this insight. Now, Francis of Assisi, as part of this great Russian spring of the 12th and early 13th century, emerges as the one now who can claim nature in a fresh and purified way, who can say, indeed, it's not our mother, it's our sister, brother sun and sister moon. He could, yes, go cavorting down that hillside in Assisi in ecstatic joy because he had recovered the authentic relationship between us and nature. So here it is again. Listen to Chesterton. God bless him. Quote, "For water itself had been washed, fire itself had been purified as by fire. Flowers smell no more of the forgotten garlands gathered in the garden of Priapus. Stars stand no more as signs of the far frigidity of gods, as cold as those cold fires. They are all like things newly made and awaiting new names. See, that's it. That's Francis. He's the one who comes along as the one to give new names. Not mother, but brother and sister, right? Does this put us on alert at a time when a neo-paganism is asserting itself? This has been true all my life. I remember as a kid in college, this sort of, the bookstores of, the wonderful Greek and Roman gods. For God's sake, I'm so glad they're gone, the Greek and Roman gods. I mean, if paganism reasserts itself, we need a new asceticism. That might be part of the call of our time, seems to me. Okay, I'm going on and on here. Anything worth doing is worth doing badly, isn't that Chesterton? Just a couple more. So we've been talking about le jongleur de Dieu, this great idea of the juggler of God. Here's a link between, I'm skipping a chapter in the book, between what I just said and what I'm going to talk about now. It's a link in the chapter called Francis the Builder. Listen, here's Chesterton. It's enough to indicate here that the whole philosophy of St. Francis revolved around the idea of a new supernatural light on things, which meant the ultimate recovery, not the ultimate refusal of natural things. Typical Chestertonian paradox, but you get the point here. Is nature is most itself when seen in light of the supernatural. The natural is truly recovered for what's beautiful in it when we see it in a supernatural light. And his way into this now, as we heard from Dale, the jongleur, the French term, but here's Chesterton, joculator or jester, what we might call a juggler, and indeed the great image of the tumbler in front of the Blessed Mother, right? But see, what GK sees here is this image of the person that's turned himself on his head. And he loves to celebrate the fool for Christ idea. In a world gone kooky, it's those who stand on their heads who see it properly, because it's all been turned upside down, right? So we need this very peculiar vision. But here he's pointing to something very particular. And here's the image. If a man saw the world upside down, with all the trees and towers hanging head downwards as in a pool, one effect would be to emphasize the idea of dependence. So here we all are, stolidly kind of sitting, gravity pulling us down to the earth, and we all are in place. But now suppose I'm on my head, and I look out at everybody, and suddenly you're all hanging from the ceiling. You're in danger of falling. Suddenly you all look very dependent. Well, this, he says, is the proper way to see the world. He imagines Francis of Assisi, the jongleur de Dieu, seeing his hometown upside down. Quoting Chesterton, instead of being merely proud of his strong city because it could not be moved, he'd be thankful to God Almighty that it had not been dropped. If you've been to Assisi and you see this kind of, fortress-like quality to it, now imagine you're on your head and you see Assisi upside down, all of it hanging. It might drop any minute. That's the right way to read it. Now, how come? Well, here I'm going to draw a link between the Francis book and the Thomas book. You remember that wonderful chapter of The Permanent Philosophy, where G.K. talks about Thomas's basic approach. He lays out the basics of Thomistic ontology. And here's how he does it. Long before a person knows that grass is grass or self is self, he knows that something is something. Perhaps it would be best to say very emphatically, with a blow upon the table, there is and is. So Thomas will say the first thing that falls under the conception of the mind is esse, is being. Being. The world is. Okay. But there's a consequent perception. Now listen, this is again G.K. in the Thomas book. Looking at being as it now is, as the baby looks at the grass, we see a second thing about it. In quite popular language, it looks secondary and dependent. Existence exists. Okay, there's the first perception. But it's not sufficiently self-existent. Now, unusual for Chesterton here. It's rather, austere philosophical language. But it's so important, everybody. The world is. There's the fundamental perception. But how is it? It is, but it doesn't have to be. That's the most fundamental way to express basic Thomistic ontology. Here we are, but we don't have to be here. None of us. My car might have broken down earlier. I might have forgotten about this date. You might have gotten sick. This room might have fallen apart. Right now, well, no, it is 95 degrees. Right now, it could be 1,000 degrees and we'd all be incinerated. Right now, it could be 89 below. We'd all be frozen. You see, my point is, yes, we're all here. But it's an illusion to think, boy, we are self-explanatory. We're not. We're not. We are, but we do not have to be. None of us. Nothing in the world. From us to the planet Jupiter to everything in between. None of us have to be here. Do you see the point is? We're all hanging. We're all dependent. We don't contain within ourselves the reason for our own existence. What do we come to ultimately, therefore? We must come ultimately to some reality which does explain itself, in whom, this is Aquinas, essence and existence coincide. That which does exist through the power of its own essence, God. Right? You see what he's driving at here is that even a child intuiting the reality of the world does in fact intuit this radical dependency. Maybe I was a weird kid, but I remember this vividly when my philosophical imagination was born. I remember it vividly. We had a little sugar bowl on our table, and I, like most kids, like to put sugar on the cereal. So I took all the sugar and it was gone. And my mother was there, and I said, "Oh, we're out of sugar." And then she went into this little thing, and she filled it up. And I remember saying to her, "Oh, that's where the sugar comes from." And she said, "Yeah." And then I said, "What happens when that runs out?" And she said, "Well, I go to the store and I get another one." Well, I was on a roll at this point, you know. What happens when that runs out? And then she eventually went back to sugar cane or whatever it was. And I remember my mother, God bless her, my Catholic mother, finally, as this annoying kid was asking questions, said, "Well, God." And that's a darn good answer. I mean, there's no more sophisticated answer than that. Because what was happening to me that moment, I was realizing the radical contingency of the existence of that sugar that I was using. And radical contingency must conduce ultimately to that which exists through the power of its own essence. Again, listen to Chesterton. Existence exists, but it is not sufficiently self-existent. Who sees that? The person that stands on his head, the jongleur de Dieu, that sees the world as radically dependent. This is a nice quote, you know, because people in GK's time were saying, well, no, doesn't evolution explain, you know, where things come from? Listen to him. In a word, the world does not explain itself and cannot do so merely by continuing to expand itself. So, you know, the point is evolution. What's that naming? Well, some process by which biological organisms develop over time. Okay, great. It doesn't bring you 1 centimeter closer to explaining why they exist at all, right? No matter what you say about its development, it's not touching this fundamental issue of why it should exist at all. Okay, now that's a little Thomistic interlude. Let's go now back to but read by Chesterton. Let's go back to Francis. A prime consequent of this insight about radical dependency is that we are all connected to each other. Here's brother, sun, sister, moon, right? Because we're all coming forth every moment. We are all radically dependent every moment upon the same source, upon the same Father. Therefore, here's GK, for us the elements are like heralds who tell us with trumpet and tabard that we are drawing near the city of a great king, but he hails them with an old familiarity that is almost an old frivolity. He calls them his brother fire and sister water. Can I suggest to everybody that last phrase is both high poetry and exact metaphysics? And you know, I think if we want to do a repetitio mater studiorum thing, this nature is not our mother, nature's our sister. That is maybe the most important thing. we're going to get from thinking about Francis in light of G.K. Chesterton. Let me skip something here because I'm kind of going on and on. This is so good. I wonder, maybe Dale knows this. Did he ever reflect on the German expression "es gibt"? I know he wasn't really attuned to German that much, but the German expression for "there is," right, is "es gibt," which means it gives. It gives. It's very peculiar. Heidegger was fascinated by that. It gives. So there is a table. There is a microphone. Es gibt. Well, who's giving? And why would I say that? Why would I say that being itself is tied to giving? Well, it's because of this insight, precisely this insight. I think G.K. would have loved that, because here's a quote from this same chapter. All things look better when they look like gifts. And then this, I love, the worst moment for the atheist is when he's really thankful and he has no one to thank, right? But see, it's typical Chestertonian wit, but boy, is that a deeply perceptive insight. You know who saw it? When's the last time you read Dorothy Day's great autobiography, The Long Loneliness? Remember when she has her child, and at the time she's unmarried, she's moving from a complete secularist viewpoint, but she's starting to think about spiritual things. And she has her baby, and she said she was sitting on the front porch of her house with the little infant baby. And she said, I felt a gratitude that was so great, I knew it would never correspond to anything in this world. It's the same insight, isn't it? The same es gibt. Something's been given, right? Something's dependent. And there's nothing in the world, because everything else in the world is dependent, has come from the same source. And when you intuit that, what's the right attitude? Thank you. Whom am I thanking? Right? That's the sad thing for the atheist. He's really thankful, and there's no one to thank. Okay, one more. I'm calling it here the virtue and limits of Franciscanism. Sorry, Father Larry, but I think you'll appreciate this. He loves the Franciscan movement, and he said, they're called not monks but friars minor, as we know. It might be expressed simply as the little brothers, because unlike the monks of old, these little brothers were meant to make their way in the world. And the trick is, and this is the old problem, how do you do that without becoming worldly? When the Bishop of Assisi wondered how the first Franciscans could live in such dire poverty, Francis said, quote, if we had any possessions, we should need weapons and laws to defend them. He's pointing to the freedom that they found in their poverty and simplicity. Here's G.K. That the dedicated man might go anywhere among any kind of men, even the worst kind of men, so long as there was nothing by which they could hold him. See, so that's the Franciscan, that's the friar minor, who's small enough, little enough, lithe and free enough to make his way through the society. G.K. says that especially medieval society was like a complex network of relationships and dependencies, and think of the feudal system and the guild economy and all of that, the church, etc. But Francis' followers chose to live outside the web. We might say today, off the grid, right? Listen to G.K. The whole idea of St. Francis was that the little brothers should be like little fishes who could go freely in and out of that net. It's nice, isn't it? It's tightly one net of the society, but they could swim in and out. They could do so precisely because they were small fishes, and in that sense, even slippery fishes. There was nothing that the world could hold them by, for the world catches us mostly by the fringes of our garments, right? They hook us because he wants money, he wants power, he wants pleasure, he wants position, and the world hooks us by these. But if you don't want those things, you're free of those things, you can move through the net of the society. Very clever. By becoming a little brother, people don't see you coming. They don't notice you. They can't hang on to you. And that gives you great evangelical freedom. G.K. observes the fact, still astonishing, when you think about it. How fast the Franciscan movement grew. Francis begins with his 12, followers, and within a few years, thousands and thousands. I love the fact they come to Francis. We want to join you, and where do we live? And out in the woods, up in the hills. I mean, he had no great plan for them, but within his own lifetime, they're all over the place. They're all over Europe. It's extraordinary how fast they grew. GK's comment: a man had to travel light in order to ride so fast and so far. Right, so that's the virtue of Franciscanism. Now, here's the balance. And it's a very important insight he has here. Having praised the Franciscan movement and obviously praised the founder of it, it is perfectly sound common sense to say there's a sense in which the ordinary man cannot be free from the world, or rather ought not to be free from the world. See, here's the temptation. We're so caught up in the beauty and lyricism of Francis, and it is beautiful and lyrical, he himself and his movement, that we might be tempted to say, well, we should all live that way. And GK's point is, no, they live that way for their evangelical purpose. That was ingredient in their mission. But not everyone is called to live that way. Why? Because people have to live within that net of the economy and politics and family life and church life and administration. Nothing wrong with all of that as long as you don't worship it. And some people have got to be in that net, right? So not everyone should be a Franciscan, even as we admire the Franciscan movement. He notices then 100 years after Francis, there's the famous battle about the Franciscan spirituals, right? Those very radical Franciscans that wanted this kind of universalizing of the absolutely radical poverty of Francis. And the church said no to that. Here's Chesterton. Very interesting. I don't think anyone has seen this either. He, Francis, had something in him of what makes the founder of a religion. See, and that's bad for Chesterton. He had something in him because he was so charismatic and he was so powerful that people might say, oh, that's a new religion. We should break with the old way. That's the way we should follow. Think here of Joachim of Fiore, right, who did just that saw Francis as a new Christ figure. The upshot was that certain Franciscans, I'm quoting again, were willing to let the Franciscan spirit escape from Christendom, as the Christian spirit had once escaped from Israel. See, that was okay, that the Christian movement eventually moved beyond Israel in a very real sense and became a new religion. But Franciscanism should not become a new religion. That was the point the Pope had to settle. This is again Chesterton. Whether Christendom should absorb Francis or Francis Christendom. See, key to the decision, this is again GK, the church could include all that was good in the Franciscans, but the Franciscans could not include all that was good in the church. Does that make sense? There was this lovely quality and necessary and beautiful quality to Francis, but it wasn't the whole of the church. So he would be like the jewel in the crown of the church, but not the crown. If he became the crown, we'd have trouble, Now, I'm going to close with this because this is one of my favorite insights from Cardinal George, who has had a big impact on me in a lot of ways. But Cardinal George one time was with a group and they were talking about pacifism. And one of the speakers was an ardent pacifist and really felt that any Christian, all Christians should be pacifists. Well, the cardinal got up afterwards and he said, I thank God every day for pacifists because there should be some people in the church who live even now the way we will live in heaven. For the same reason, he said, I love celibates in the church because they signal even now how we will all live in heaven. But then he said, just as I'm really glad not everyone's a celibate, I'm also really glad not everyone's a pacifist. Because some people in society shouldn't be pacifists. They have think of police officers, think of military figures, think of political leaders, And I thought that was about the wisest thing I'd ever heard on that issue because it gave full weight to pacifism. It gave full weight to it, how important it's been in the history of the church. But it didn't turn it into the crown. It left it as a jewel in the crown. Does that make sense? I think it's exactly the same point that GK is making. Okay, as promised, 2 more minutes. Let me do a little conclusion. I'm going to draw from this. First thing for our society, we need to fall in love again with Christ. That's Francis. He was in love with Jesus, which is why he could be the kid tripping down the hillside in Assisi and the guy with the skull at his feet. And that all makes perfect sense as long as you're in love with Jesus. Secondly, we need to stop worshiping the world. There's my sermon and this talk in a nutshell. Don't worship the world. Don't turn nature into our mother. Nature's not a god or a goddess. Brother, sun, sister, moon, all that. Thirdly, we need to see everything's upside down. We need to stand on our heads more often and see the world as dependent and non-self-explanatory. And then finally, we need Franciscan freedom. I love that. I mean, I'm an evangelist, and I think we all are called to that. And that little kind of slippery fish quality, we can get in and out of the net, we're not caught that easily, that's really indispensable for evangelists. Okay, and the very last thing, I'm heading off Saturday for Lisbon, so World Youth Day. We got 29,000 American kids going, which is great. So say a prayer for that, and then I'm going to the Synod in October, which some of us are kind of concerned about. So pray for me in October. God bless you all. Thanks. God bless you all. Thanks for that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to come up here on stage and make everyone give me a standing ovation, but you should really. Let's hear it for Bishop Barron, though, huh? All right. So 2 things. I really want to thank you for bringing up Father Rudke's name and Father Lyon's name. Most of the folks here wouldn't know them, but. And when I went to the early Chesterton conference in Milwaukee 108 years ago, they were speakers at those first classes. There was about 25 of us sitting on folding chairs in a room. Yeah. They were just great, man. I had Father Lyons at my home for dinner before I became Catholic, and he left most of the dinner on his. Yeah. All right, but the other thing is I brought this box up here, Your Excellency, and There's an award for you in this box. Yeah. But you have to open it slowly because it bites. Now, as often as we can every year, we try to recognize someone who has done more work for us than we've done for ourselves. To recognize someone who's not directly affiliated with the Chesterton Society, and we call it the Outline of Sanity Award, and this year you are the recipient. He's got the camera there. So.